Good afternoon. Thank you so much. It's good to be here, even though it's very cold. I come from Indonesia. Actually, after this, I will go back to Canberra, and that's there. It's almost 40 degrees Celsius. So I have to have a lot of vitamin C, I think, Rick. And I was worried actually before I came here because Jakarta is really in a bad shape now because of the flooding and all. So I was worried. I told Rick that I probably cannot make it to the airport, but fortunately I could. So I'm here now. Thank you again for UBC to invite me. This is actually part of my collaboration with Dr. Pittman, Potter, Rick, and others in this project. So I'm gonna talk. A part of it is globalization and poverty. Many of you probably have questioned already what is the link of globalization to poverty, because this is rather controversial. This is still being debated. Maybe we know quite clear the relation between globalization and growth, for example, but to poverty or inequality is far more complex. And I'm going to use Indonesian case to explore on this relationship. And as Rick said, I will also take examples from the cases of rice and fuel pricing in Indonesia. These are very controversial issues in Indonesia. And finally, I will offer some ways around or some ways on how to reap the benefits of globalization while minimizing the negative impacts of it through some routes in Indonesia, for example, in improving the investment in human resources and physical infrastructure, and also use the institution like SMEs. So the outline of the presentation are actually just three issues. The first, of course, the definition of globalization and its links to growth, inequality, and poverty, or sometimes we call it PGI, poverty, growth, and inequality triangle. And then responses against globalization. Why against? Because in countries like Indonesia, usually the public at large have big resistance towards globalization, because the theme in developing economy like Indonesia is how to eradicate poverty, how to reduce inequality. And many times people perceive globalization as factors that bring these two factors into developing countries like Indonesia. So I'm going to talk also about Indonesian population's response towards globalization with illustrations from two cases, rice and fuel policy. And then the last part is to how to take advantage of globalization through human resources, infrastructures, and institutions. So basically those are the three parts of the presentation. So now, at the end of the slide there, I have listed references, so you can probably consult if you like. But in general, globalization usually is defined or characterized by increase in trade in goods and services, movement of capital, movement of people, movement of labor, and also, of course, information flow of and technology. And these imply increases in countries' openness, so exposure towards other countries, and also interdependence among countries. So this is a simple graph trying to see the connection between globalization, economic growth, and inequality and distribution. In the upper part, you will see that in the economic growth, inequality, and distribution has some kind of bidirectional relationship, and also with poverty. Some of these are quite clear from evidence, but some of these are also still mixed from the literature. So the debate is still going on. So usually the question with regards to globalization is, does it help or does it not help or hurt the poor? Again, there is no simple answer. There is no simple solution. It can help, for example, if it increases job, it provides cheaper consumption, it provides large opportunity in health, in education, and also entrepreneurship. But it can also hurt countries in the sense that probably some workers are displaced because there is the distributional impact of jobs. And then oftentimes also poor consumers pay more or not less for what they need. So, but some empirical studies have tried to explore this, and on average their conclusion is that countries that have embraced globalization have done better, okay, on the whole, than those who have not. And within those countries, economic growth has raised income at all levels, including those of the poor. And then usually they use some success stories of ASEAN countries, including Indonesia. But again, its relation to inequality is far more complex. So the relationship between globalization and poverty, first, globalization and growth is quite standard, acceptable among economists that it's good. But then globalization to poverty is still being debated, and the one that is far more complex is globalization and inequality. So if we think about this as the triangle, the poverty, growth, and inequality. So in general, the lessons that learned in the literature are globalization alone is never enough to cure poverty. We need other things, and sometimes, many studies have concluded that these include investment in capital and infrastructure, education and health, so human resources, good governance, institution, and labor market regulation. In the case of Indonesia, I can talk about this maybe one day, but of course this is too long, so I'm going to focus in some the most important aspects of globalization in Indonesia. So let me first, maybe you have known, many of you have known about Indonesia, but let me refresh your memory about Indonesia. So Indonesia has maintained a very relatively high growth trajectory. So now it's almost always above 6%. It's quite impressive. And then we have seen also increase in openness in terms of export, import over GDP. And there is continuous increase in capital inflow. So investment is coming, foreign reserves is high. And also there is an increase in number of migrant workers. So we send workers abroad, and remittance is increasingly high. And then this is the interesting part. We experienced AFC, or ASEAN Financial Crisis, 97, 98, and it was really bad for the country because the growth was minus 13. So it's the worst in Asia. Of course, the worst in the world because it was in Asia. But interestingly, in the recent crisis, what we call GFC, Global Financial Crisis, we came up very resiliently. So 4.5. Only 3 countries in the region, so China, India, and Indonesia. Others have negative growth. So what explained this? For both, actually, people say that globalization. So when we had this very bad growth in 97, 98, people blame globalization because we are too, exposed to other countries, trade, and so forth. So we have this, attack from foreign economy. But then when we we grew quite impressively in the recent crisis, people give the credit to globalization too. So because, we trade with others. So it's very interesting. But the debate, the popular debate is still, they said that we are hit by the crisis. It was globalization, but we were better in the global financial crisis because our exposure is less than other countries in the region. For example, taking Thailand or the Philippines, for example. So, and then they they jump into wrong conclusion. They said that because our exposure is not as high as other countries in the region, then we are not attacked so much, so we can grow quite impressively. So the conclusion is that we should open less, which I think is a very dangerous way of thinking. Because actually, if you talk with businesses, for example, every day they have complaint about infrastructure, about logistics, and they say our export is small because we have to deal with very poor roads, very poor ports. So basically, actually, they want more export rather than less export. They want more openness, despite this popular resistance towards globalization. But despite the rosy picture of Indonesian macroeconomics fundamentals, there are still some challenges. And in terms of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, we have seen that even though the poverty is constantly declined, but it's still relatively high. The recent figures is 12.5%, national poverty line. And then unemployment is declining too, but it's still quite high. And the most depressing one is inequality actually increases. So in 2009, measured with in Gini ratio, measure of inequality, it was 0.3537. Now it's 0.4. So the inequality increases. This is conceptual way of thinking about globalization, and in this case, we limit the definition to trade. So you have trade policy, and conceptually, it will affect enterprise. There is a distributional impact, and then governance, and then how it affects the individuals and household. It seems very simple, but empirically, it's complicated. So this is how we actually try to look at the linkage between globalization and how it affects the individuals and households, and also firms and businesses. So I'm going to skip this. These are just some updates on trade figures in Indonesia. Basically, we're on the current account, we have deficit, but it is covered by surplus in capital account. So we have actually a surplus in the balance of payment. I have also a picture on non-oil and gas and trade, because there is still some fallacy out there that Indonesia is a rich oil country. No more. We were a member of OPEC, but now we quit OPEC because we are net importer already. Okay, so, and this is related to my story later on fuel pricing. Okay. And in terms of openness, Indonesia is one of the countries in the region that is usually considered as a very good boy, in the sense that we have reduced our tariffs dramatically, so we have very low tariff. So we're very good in welcoming or having openness with other countries. But that's as far as tariff is concerned, because if you look at this is the average. If you look at the other measures, we can see that actually non-tariff measures are increasing in Indonesia. What are these non-tariff measures? For example, standards, using environment as protection for trade. So these actually are increasing, despite the fact that on tariff, we already have very low tariffs. So now, based on those backgrounds, let me give us some food for thought. First, globalization brings both good and bad effects. These are, I think, is settled in the literature. In general, studies show that the net effect is positive. Of course, there is some negative effect. However, the links between globalization to poverty and to inequality remain complex and country-specific. So it might be different in the case of Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries. Now, since poverty and inequality are always sensitive issues, especially in developing economies like Indonesia, globalization is often resisted rather than embraced. So we still see demonstrations, anti-globalization protests and things like that. Many things like that in Indonesia. And now I want to talk about the two opposing cases. Why opposed? Because this is very, very interesting. Rice, for example, rice. In Indonesia, since you are in primary school, you have been taught that we are agriculture country. We have, so many farmers, so we have to protect them. How to protect them? We have to keep the rice price high. Okay, so that's the way we are taught in schools. So the government want to keep the price high in order to protect the producers. On the contrary, in the case of fuel, the way we are taught is that we are oil rich, even though now we are not. So it should be the case that the people have to enjoy cheap fuel price, cheap fuel, right? So, and I will show you that these two are actually fallacies in the current Indonesia. However, it's still going on. So the government policy is also still use this as their way of thinking. Now, first, the case of rice. Okay, so rice was liberalized in 1999. It was part of a letter of intent. So ASEAN financial crisis, and then we invited IMF. One of the recipes that they gave us is to liberalize the rice market. Okay, and then there's specific tariff, and then there is a non-tariff barrier in terms of import arrangement, control, and everything. Now it's quite free, but still, whenever the government wanted to import rice, it has to be approved by the House, the Parliament, because it's always controversial. And why I think this is important, because many of you have read Sen's work, it's about entitlement to food or capability, so people's ability to eat. Okay. And why I think this is a fallacy, because actually if you look at the Indonesian poorest, and many of them are actually peasants, so landless farmers. They're farmers, but they're workers, right? So basically, protecting producers is missing the point, because actually they are net consumers. So the poorest farmers in Indonesia are net consumers, whose interest is actually cheaper price of rice, right? But the government wants to protect the farmers, who actually are the one with land, the richer farmer, the trader, rather than the poorest one, who don't even have, or even they have piece of land is very small. So in results of this protection, so we have seen the diverging gap between international and domestic prices in Indonesia. Of course, there is some abnormality during, in 2006, 2007, the international price was really wide. But in general, the international price has been lower than the Indonesian domestic price. We use Thai rice price as the international benchmark. This shows that globalization is not really working here, right? Because globalization implies that actually the price is going to be equalized across countries. But the question is, who is actually being protected? So the government of Indonesia's objective is to have a safe, what they call safe stockpile. Just like the Japanese government, they have a huge stockpile, and when there is flood or natural disasters, they can release the rice. Why they have such safe stockpile? They also want to stabilize the prices. So an import is always opposed by the Farmers Association, the House, the Parliament, and NGOs, actually. And one interesting fact is that in 2005, October, there was a bold policy by the government, and that was to increase the price of fuel. Okay? I'm talking now about rice, but this is related to fuel also later on. On October 2005, the government decided to increase the price of fuel as a consequence of reducing the subsidy, because it was not, it was already very burdening the budget, so they decided to reduce the subsidy, and as a consequence, the price increased. Okay, and people blame this policy as the factor that increased the poverty from 2005 February, 16% to almost 18% in March 2006. But studies have shown that actually that analysis is not correct, because there was another policy at that time, and that is the import ban of rice that resulted in the skyrocketing domestic price of rice. And this actually is responsible for 70% more of the rise of poverty rate in Indonesia. So it's not so much, it's not from the increase in fuel price, but it's from banning the import of rice in the time that people needed the rice the most. Okay. So in conclusion, in some of my studies also with BRIC, rice import ban good for richer farmers, absentee landlords, and few other interest groups, and but not for the poorest farmers. Okay, even after we consider the employment effect, because some people said, well, if we increase the price, or if we keep the price of rice high, that means we give incentive to landlords to hire more workers, in this case farmers. But studies by people like Patunru at ANU have shown that actually that effect is smaller than the effect of price increase. Okay, so this is a distributional consequences if you want to see actually who are protected, because if we go back to the thinking that we are protecting the rice price in order to protect the producer, actually it's wrong. Why? Because if we look at this table, for the country as a whole, actually more than 80% of households in Indonesia is net consumers. We are not producers. Okay, about 90% of urban households, 60% of rural households do not grow rice. 9% of rural households that grow rice are net consumers. So in general, they are net consumers. Okay, so keeping price high is actually not good. And if we look at the need of the poorest, their consumption patterns, we can see that the role of food is actually very, very big. You can see rice and noodles has a very big role in their expenditure. So back to Sen's idea of capability and entitlement, it's wrong to protect the price of rice this way, because we actually block the people's entitlement to food. And why is this also related to globalization? So this is another story that I want to talk about, because actually it shows how globalization and price affected countries, not just one country, but many countries in the world. So if you remember in 2006, 2007, there was a huge price increase in the world market of rice. And one of the first trigger actually came from US. How is that? US has a subsidy on biofuels industry. Because it's so huge, it attracted so many farmers to switch from planting corn and wheat into planting corn and wheat for biofuels, not for food. But as a result, the price of wheat in the international price increased very significantly. And India reacted. India said that this is not good because we are the biggest importer of wheat from US, and the price of wheat is skyrocketing, so we have to do something on our domestic market. What they did, actually, they want their people to switch from wheat to rice, because they are actually one of the biggest exporter of rice. So what they did, they banned rice export. So automatically, many people moved from wheat to rice. But this was not stopped there. This didn't stop there because other countries like Vietnam, for example, they also think, okay, we are also export-producing countries for rice. We should do the same because otherwise we're the one who's going to get the bad luck. So they also banned their export. Okay, so at that time, these factors, all of them contributed to the skyrocketing of the price of rice. So my point is, in the era of globalization like this, for very important commodity like price, we need to coordinate, we need to cooperate. So I always think about, some kind of information house in Southeast Asia, for example, so that we know the supply in the Philippines, we know the supply in Thailand, in Indonesia, because otherwise we keep doing these things. This is like a prisoner's dilemma situation. So that's about the food. And then now the second one in Indonesia, the case of fuel. First, why is this important? The last point there. Because the poorest, they rely very much on kerosene. And they also use fuel for their works, like what do you call ojek, motorbikes, So this is also very important. But in contrast to rice, in fuel, the government wants to keep it low, to keep the price low, so it's always subsidized. And this is a very interesting news from a local newspaper. They reported that the price of subsidized gasoline in Kalimantan, one of the islands in Indonesia, hit a record of 20,000 rupiah. Okay? At the time when the government officially set the price of 5,000 or 5,000 to 6,000. So this implies that despite the fact that the government administered the price, but because the incentive to smuggle is very big, so people smuggle it. Okay? And because of this, many poor people, they cannot have, their access to fuel was reduced significantly. And I will show later that, this is the gap between the domestic and international price, just like the price of rice in terms of fuel is also diverging. And also like the case of rice, if we look at the distributional impact, actually this policy is enjoyed more by the rich rather than the poor. Because if you look at, this is the consumption decile, so the top 10% actually enjoys almost 50% of the subsidy, while the bottom 10% also just consume less than 2% of the subsidy. So it's regressive. So if the government said they're protecting the poor by keeping the price of fuel low, it's actually not correct. Okay. So those are the two cases. So now the question will be, then how do we reap the benefits of the globalization and, of course, minimize its negative impact? Some of the literature that I listed in the reference concluded that actually we need to invest in human resources, and that's education and investment. And I think that's also correct for Indonesian case. Okay. And then improvement in physical infrastructure. Why is this important? In one of my papers, I argued that actually Indonesia economy, the problem of Indonesian economy is more on the supply side rather than demand side. Why? If you look at the demand side, export is quite good. Actually, domestic consumption is also very good. But the growth, overall growth, is still less than comparative like China and India. So the question is, what restricts, what limits the growth? And I think it's on the supply side. And when we talk about supply side, it's the infrastructure, especially roads and ports. So this is about connectivity, right? Indonesia has almost 17,000 islands. It's a big archipelago. But ironically, it doesn't have one international hub port like Singapore or Hong Kong. So if people think that Indonesia, a big archipelago, should be able to take advantage of its water, geography, it's not the case. Actually, the way of thinking in Indonesia is still on land transportation, which now is very difficult, and on the port, it's very inefficient. Okay, so my institute tried to measure this, the logistic cost. We came up with 14% of production cost is actually for logistic. It's very high compared to Japan, for example, 3% or 4%. And these logistic costs usually in the poor road, poor infrastructure, but also illegal collection on the road. You know what I mean? So the police and other officials taking money on the streets. Okay, so logistics is very important. And then the other thing that I think can also help us reap the benefit of globalization is enabling institutions like SMEs. And I will argue that SMEs is very small and medium enterprises are very important, have very important role in Indonesia because of the huge number. And again, these are country specific. But let me first briefly tell you about the condition of human resources in Indonesia. Now this is on education. And I think this is very important because now we always say that Indonesia is enjoying demographic dividend. Okay, what is demographic dividend? We are now a young population, unlike Japan, of course, China, for example. They are old population, they have aging society. Indonesia is young, so we have to take advantage of this. But we can't if education is still like this, the current days, because demographic dividend will last in 20 years' time. So we need to invest on children now, and that's education. And also, in terms of education, not just children are now at disadvantage, but also the female population. So being a female in Indonesia increases the chance to experience deprivation in education. Okay, twice as much female population aged 10 and above as their male counterpart cannot read, and 3 times as much never enroll in schools. So there is a gender issue also in terms of education. In terms of health, there are the statistics have shown progress, but still there are still some depressing issues, like the number of babies not having complete immunization is still high. The probability of having diarrhea is 8% for children up to 5 years old. If he or she, or if it's female, got no immunization, living in a rural area, living in a house whose largest floor are still dirt or soil, has no toilet facility. We still have lots of households like that. And this probability is higher in poor provinces, of course. So those are human resources related issues, education and health. And this is about the connectivity, the point that I said that we need infrastructures most. If you look at this shows that Indonesia, unlike other countries in the region, are not so much linked with other countries. In the region now, especially in East Asia, there is this regional production network, with China being the locomotive, and other countries are supplying things, parts and components to China, get assembled there, and they send this to North America and Europe. But these numbers show that Indonesia is still lag behind. And why? It's the infrastructure. Not just with other countries, but even within the country, Indonesia, between islands, Indonesia, the connectivity is still problematic. So you can see, for example, for trivial stuff like rice, flour, sugar, oil, the price differences can be really high. And why is that? very high because of the very bad, very difficult connectivity, very bad road, ports, etc. So now the last one is enabling institutions like SMEs. Why are they important? They absorb more than 95% of total workforce. Okay, the small and medium enterprise, they account for more than 97% of total firm establishment, contribute more than 50% of GDP, cover 50% of total investment, and supply a lot of export. And these are the SME. These are the definition. So in Indonesia, we actually call it MSME, not just SME, because there's micro. By definition, it's very small, sometimes 2 or 3 people. Okay. And in terms of this SME, policies that have tried to address this is what we call financial inclusion. How we make them have more access to finance. And I think I agree with this approach, because if you look at, with comparison with other countries, financial access in Indonesia is still very low. So you can see, for example, ATM per 100,000 adults is still very low compared to Singapore, of course. Malaysia, Philippines, and India is still comparative to us. So in conclusion, first point is globalization might bring positive and negative effects. The net impact, as documented by many studies, is in general positive. Okay? But resistance against globalization is usually brought up by a worry that globalization hurts the poor. In some cases, yes, it hurts the poor because of the dislocation of that brought by job change. Then, however, the consequences might be unintended, as exemplified by the case of rice and fuel protection in Asia. What I'm saying is that the resistance towards globalization is responded by the government by populist policies, like protecting the rice and fuel, but actually it has unintended consequence. So as I discussed, so ways to reap the benefits of globalization, I think, is more, rather than populist policies like that, is to look at the infrastructure, soft, human resources, and hard, ports and roads, and also institutions like SMEs. So thank you very much. Sorry for taking so much time.
So I just want to have I just have one question. This is great, really helpful, and really moving. So thank you for that. But the question of unintentional consequences.
Yes.
So the cynic in me looks at those who benefit from rights protection, absentee landlords, larger firms, and so on. And the cynic in me looks at who benefits from fuel protection, wealthy more than poor. And the cynic in me then says, well, when you look at a political process, a political economy where those vested interests have more influence, then maybe it's not an unintended consequence. Maybe it's an intended consequence as a result of the political economy.
That's a good point. I think if you look at that from that point of view, I think, yeah. No, that's very interesting because, well, probably you are right, because like in terms of rice, for example, one of the persons who runs for president actually is the leader of this farmers association. But many of the members actually are rich farmers. And he used this sentiment in the media and in campaign that we are still agriculture country, we have lots and lots of farmers, we have to protect them because then, but the fallacy is still there because people still think that we are producers. Well, in fact, if you just take random, talk with random farmers in the street, most likely they're very poor, and then you ask, what kind of rice that you plant? And he will answer, it's this variety, which is a very good one. Do you eat that? No, I can't afford that one. Because I plant that, and then it belongs to the landlord. They sell it in the market. For me and my family, I have to go to the market to buy lower quality of rice. And in fact, there's another policy, it's called raskin, beras untuk orang miskin, or rice for the poor, by the government. to subsidize the consumption of this kind of people. Again, this is another issue because it's also field for corruption there. But yeah, take your point. If you look at this problem from that point of view, I think it's intended by those who have power to this issue. Also in the fuel, because there has been some news reporting smuggling, on big smuggling of fuel, because it's so cheap in Indonesia, it's so expensive in the Philippines, so they, it's natural they smuggle it, and these are mafia, the fuel mafia in Indonesia. Of course, they benefit from the policy, the fuel price policy in Indonesia.
So I'm curious, in other places when you raise price of food,
yeah.
It leads to riots, and the same way with price of fuel, if you raise it, it leads to riots. So what about the situation in Indonesia that people are kind of accepting it?
Yeah. The story that I told you in 2005, October, it was a big increase in fuel price, 120%. And people were afraid that it's going to be a big revolution, but no, it didn't. But of course, the debate was very heated at that time. And some economists and policy advisors have, tried to persuade the government that we could have avoided this kind of, big shock to the consumers, especially the poor, if we actually increase it gradually. Not 120% one time, but probably 5% each year. Okay? But even that is not, it doesn't sell to the government's ears, especially this year. This year is the election year, 2014 actually, but now everybody is talking about election already. So I don't think there's going to be any change on fuel and food price. In terms of food, you said that probably it's going to be a riot when food price increases. Not in the case of rice, because as I said, the way they make people believe is that we are producers. So high price for rice is good.
I don't know. If I am a consumer,
right?
I don't care about who gets benefits. My rice, I can't feed my family.
That's right.
Or is there a big substitution to other?
The one that I said, the rice for the poor, it's a big subsidy program.
No, I'm not talking about subsidies, but is there like cheap wheat that people substitute from rice, or is the rice eating is very entrenched?
No, it's still rice, yeah. But you are right. Of course, there is a limit to the increase of domestic price of rice. So the way the government now has the policy is to have a range of prices. So whenever it hits it's almost reached the upper and then they have the open market operation through the state logistic agencies. Yeah. Yeah.
How likely is it that policymakers will consider research such as yours or other economists?
That's a very hard question. My institute before I joined ANU, Institute for Economic and Social Research, we actually have very close friends in the government. So usually, over lunch or coffee, we talk about this, and they actually understand this very well. Okay, so it's a matter of policy making on the top, I think, personally. So because, for example, I talk with friends in the Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Agriculture. They understand that this is very, very bad policy, and then in terms of fuel subsidy, for example. Now, I think almost everybody knows the bad effect, because it has three bad things, at least. First, it eats up the portion in the budget that we should have used for infrastructure. Okay, because we have this problem, and it should have been more productive if it is used for building infrastructure and ports. Okay, the second negative of the fuel subsidy is that it is regressive, because 50% of it is enjoyed by the richest, only less than 2% is enjoyed by the poorest. And the third one, and not many people talk about this already, but we start to campaign about this, is environmentally unfriendly. Why? Because we keep subsidizing the fossil fuel, right? So we actually suppress the incentive to move to renewable energy. I talk with business communities in energy. I ask, why don't you start developing renewable energy, for example? Okay, and they said, like a thermal, micro hydro. They said, it's useless. If we provided renewable energy, we cannot compete with the subsidized price of the fuel. Nobody is going to buy our product. So basically, that's another consequence of keeping the price. Whether or I think the government understands this, but it's already in the mind of the public that we have to have lower fuel price and expensive for rice, right? So, and then when it comes to politics, especially in this time when the election is around the corner, it's very hard to sell populist policies. But I think they understand the problem. Yeah.
My name is Taufik. I would like to know you talk about the implications or the impact of globalization on Indonesian economy as a whole.
Right.
My question is, I want to know whether there is a particular impact or whether that globalization thing that you said is also applicable to the border area. For example, in the border area between Indonesia and Malaysia in Borneo, because I've been there recently to do some small research. It seemed to me that the thing that you mentioned might be applicable in general, but not quite for the border area. Have you looked into that?
No, honestly, no. I have not looked at the border area. It's going to be very interesting to look at it. Yeah.
But just for example, the price of fuel that you mentioned there is very high in the hinterlands. As a result, people actually go to the Malaysia to purchase the fuel. So this could bring a different dynamics. That is the actually I would like to know about that.
Yeah.
You haven't looked into it yet.
No, but yes, there are some reports about smuggling already. But I haven't really looked at it.
In all the major rice-trading countries, do you see any political interest in the kind of cooperation you were talking about?
Cooperation between countries? You mean Indonesia with other countries in the region? Yeah, I think because this already has reached the regional forum like ASEAN, APEC. We were the chief of ASEAN last year, and now APEC. I think and also Indonesia is part of G20. So I believe that the government, because actually they realize this issue, they want to have some cooperation. Even I can sense that because they cannot really persuade the public towards non-populist ideas, they want to use this kind of international forum, international frameworks to actually, have policies that make sense. For example, there has been some initiative in the ASEAN countries towards information clearinghouse on food. Like for example, on rice, the supply in Thailand, in Vietnam, in Indonesia. So we know, we can avoid things like what happened in 2006, 2007. In terms of fuel, the bigger umbrella is energy policy. There's been some initiative, Indonesia, Australia, Indonesia, and other countries in the region. Yeah. Yes.
I'm interested in what you were saying about the fact that Indonesian populations today are more consumers rather than producers.
For rice.
For rice, exactly. And that whole idea that the countryside today seems to not, it's no longer a place for the small farmers to produce rice. How big today is the number of these small farmers in the countryside? I'm trying to make a connection with the increasing migrations of people from the countryside to the peri-urban or to the city. How do you make that connection between?
You mean from agriculture sector towards, for example, manufacturing in urban areas?
Yes, like the fact that
Yeah.
the production of rice,
Yeah.
the producers of rice is decreasing, and you have more people
Yeah.
somehow just becoming consumers. And how does that connect to the move of people from?
You just touched on another very important issue, and that is the labor movement, labor market in Indonesia. And this is also problematic. Why? Because the labor market is very rigid in Indonesia, and it makes the movement from one sector to another is quite difficult. For example, from agriculture to manufacturing, because manufacturing, most of this work are formal, right? In formal sectors, they are subject to labor law. And the labor law in Indonesia is very rigid in the sense that now it's very hard for employers for their hire and firing policy, because it's very difficult for them, for example, to hire more and more labor, because they are subjected to, for example, severance payment that is highest in the world. To give you an illustration, if you fire a worker in Indonesia, regardless of the reason of the mistake, you can still end up paying 24, 25 months of salary for the what is called compensation, severance payment. It's regarded as one of the highest in the world. And also now we cannot freely outsource. Okay, so all these things. At first, the community, the business community, they could afford the minimum wage, but it's just recently, for example, in Jakarta, it increased almost 50%. In Tangerang, it's 70% increase. So of course, now they are very concerned about this. So what they do actually is to reduce the number of the workers they have, or they cancel their plan for expansion. So it's becoming more difficult for people outside manufacturing to come into this formal in manufacturing sectors, and so some of them who are still in agriculture, they have to be still in agriculture while real productivity actually decrease, because there's too many, poor farmers with a limited piece of land, okay, and they cannot really move to other sectors because of this labor market policy.
Say that they would end up in the city as what we call,
urban poor.
Informal sector.
Yes.
And how is the difference between informal sector and the SME that you were talking about?
Many SMEs are actually informal sectors. Okay, yeah. And another issue to that is this connectivity. Okay, so the connectivity is not just hard infrastructure like ports and road, but also free movement of labor from one sector to another sector. Yeah.
You mentioned Indonesia's growth rate has been relatively steadily impressive over the past few years, 5 or 6%. Do you know how much of that is accounted for by resource extraction or increased resource extraction as opposed to industrialization and manufacturing? Like, are the numbers telling the full story there?
Well, I don't have the exact number, but yes, our export especially is really rely much on the resource. Okay, so that's also a concern because of sustainability issue. We want, well, of course, our comparative advantage is still agriculture, but not agriculture in traditional way. But we want to move towards, for example, agribusiness. Okay, while also revitalizing the manufacturing, because before ASEAN financial crisis, the growth of manufacturing is always above the national average, the national growth. After the crisis, always 3%, 4%. It's far lower than the national average. It's just recently they started to pick up again, but still below the... Yes.
Right now, yeah.
ASEAN, 97, 98. Yeah.
I do have another one, actually.
Yeah.
So you mentioned fuel smuggling, right?
Right.
As an incentive for keeping the price relatively low. Is that because the differential between the price that the smugglers pay versus what they fetch is higher? So do the smugglers have some sort of relationship with, like, are they high-profile individuals? Or, I mean...
That's hard to prove, actually, but no, this is from my anecdotal conversation with those in Pertamina, national oil company, and also some in the Ministry of Trade, and they said that and the reports in the news, the police captured one boat full of fuel tank, but actually not just between countries. Even in the gas station, you can see this happening. So this is very interesting illustration because Toyota, what do you call it, minivan. Some minivan, they come to the gas station, okay, but when they fill in their gas, the nozzle comes through the window, not through the, and inside the fan there's gallon, so they put it there, and then they will bring this and then they sell it on the streets. Okay, so black market also happens inside the country.
So is it organized crime or something, or is it petty organized crime, or is it? I'm wondering what the institutional incentive to keep that price low might actually be, or if this is just sort of anecdotal. People get away with what they can get away with.
Yeah, petty crimes, I think, within the country, but I have this suspicion that also organized when it smuggled, between countries. And the response is actually doesn't make sense. For example, the government said that we still do not want to fix the price. We do not want to increase the price, but we probably will put police officer in all these gas stations. So imagine how expensive is that, right?
Why is that a matter of not having in certain areas gas stations, so it's not accessible to the poor people?
What do you mean?
Well, if everyone can go to the gas station, then they would pay what they pay in the gas station. So the only way...
I understand your point. Yeah.
Is a service.
Okay? Yeah.
And quite clearly, people who don't have access pay...
But I think it's also the scarcity. I mean, we don't have that much oil, actually. So...
then the gas station would go dry.
Yes.
Right.
You have shortages, right?
We do have shortages.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
the gas station would not have...
Right. And when there is a rumor, for example, that finally the government is going to increase or make adjustment, you will see like 2 kilometers queuing, right? And some of these people who cannot afford to stand in the line already, they just go, buying from the bottle from these guys with minivan. And sometimes the price actually very close to the real price, like 12,000 in the bottle per liter. So yeah, it's very interesting.